I need
a big conference on Thursday in DC that you'd be more than welcome at to go into this exactly with the VLR framework that's behind all of this as a topic to kick off a conversation hosted by Georgetown Law School, but with 7 other sponsoring organizations: World Bank, ECLAC, IADB, RFF, Peterson Institute, Silverado Policy Accelerator, all playing a role. So seriously, if you want to come, let me know, with a Thursday program and a dinner to follow.
Great.
Wonderful. Tori, get us started.
Okay, wonderful. Going to start it right now.
We're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Linda Bragin. I'm a senior attorney with the Environmental Law Institute and a lecturer in law at Vanderbilt University Law School. I'm going to hand it over to Tori Rickman, a research associate with ELI, to go over first logistics today.
Thank you, Linda. So welcome everyone to our webinar on designing effective border carbon adjustment mechanisms, aligning the global trade and climate regimes. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items. First, we'll be posting the recording as well as the slides from this webinar on the LPAR website. The link is in the chat. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box and hopefully we'll get a chance to ask the authors. And now I'm going to introduce our moderators for today. First up, we have Mike Vandenberg, who is the David Daniels Allen Distinguished Chair in Law at Vanderbilt University Law School, as well as the Director of the Climate Change Research Network and co-director of the Energy, Environment, and Land Use Program. And secondly, we have Linda Bragin, who's a senior attorney at the Environmental Law Institute and also teaches as a lecturer in law at Vanderbilt University Law School. But for the purposes of today, Linda and Mike are the co-instructors of the Environmental Law and Policy Annual Review, LPAR, at Vanderbilt Law. I will pass it on to you now, Mike.
Thanks so much, Tori. We're really excited to be here. The article we're talking about today was selected for publication in the Environmental Law and Policy Annual Review, or LPAR, as we call it. And LPAR is both a class and a publication. So it's a novel creature that Linda and I created years ago. And what happens is the class reads the 300 to 500 environmental law articles published every year in the fall and the spring semesters. And then it works with the course instructors and ELI experts and an outside advisory team, which includes academics and leaders, often former Senate confirmed officials from Republican and Democratic administrations, a balanced outside advisory board. We appreciate their contributions a great deal. And then we republish short forms of the winning articles and we highlight them at a conference at the ELI office in DC, as well as webcasts and podcasts like this one here. So the goal of the LPAR process is first to advance and encourage the addressing of feasibility in legal scholarship, both to make legal scholarship more relevant, but also to improve the quality of the theoretical scholarship so that we hold people's feet to the fire. We don't invent a can opener every time we need to open a can. Second, it is to move the best academic ideas into the policy discourse. And then last, but on some level, most important, it's to provide an educational experience to the students. You'll see students participating throughout the process today. And we think this is an extraordinary way to bring students into the process of developing academic and policy relevant scholarship. So with that, I'll turn the agenda back over to Linda Bregan.
Thanks, Mike. And if you're interested in some of the other articles that were selected this year, the top 20 are posted on the Environmental Law Institute LPAR website, and you can access them from there. So the game plan for today is that two of our star Vanderbilt Law students, Sydney Schoonover and Kyle Blasinski, who are the incoming and current editors-in-chief of LPAR, are going to introduce our speakers. The professors will present for about a half hour, and then Kyle and Sydney will dialogue with them on some questions they prepared. In the remaining time, we'll take questions from the audience. As Tori said, please use the Q&A box, and I will pick questions out of the Q&A to pose to the professors. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to hand it over to Sydney and Kyle. Kyle is a fourth-year student in the joint JD PhD program in Law and Economics at Vanderbilt Law School, where he is studying risk, environmental regulation, and behavioral economics. He currently serves as the senior articles editor for the Vanderbilt Law Review, and as I said, is the editor-in-chief of LPAR this year. Sydney is a third-year student also in the joint JD PhD program in Law and Economics at Vanderbilt, where she's studying environmental risk and regulation. She currently serves as an articles editor on the Vanderbilt Law Review and is the future EIC of the Environmental Law and Policy Annual Review. So as you can tell, they are stellar students, and I'm going to hand it over to them to introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Professor Bregan. I'm going to try and live up to that bar that you've set with stellar LPAR students. Those are official titles. I'm going to put that on my resume. But I'm most pleased to introduce our speakers today, the first of which is Dr. Goran Dominioni, who's an assistant professor in law with tenure at Dublin City University School of Law and Government. His primary research interests are carbon pricing, international maritime transport, and climate change law. Dr. Dominioni is also currently the principal investigator of a World Bank-funded project on the implementation of carbon pricing in international shipping and of a UN Foundation grant on the same topic. He's also an author on several World Bank reports, including the report Carbon Revenues from International Shipping, Enabling an Effective and Equitable Transition, as well as the report Distributing Carbon Revenues from Shipping. Dr. Dominioni was also a member of the team that wrote the World Bank flagship report, State and Trends of Carbon Pricing 2019. Dr. Dominioni's research has been awarded prizes from various institutions, including the MIT Climate CoLab, Yale Law School, and the World Bank. Dr. Dominioni holds an LLM from Yale Law School and a PhD in Law and Economics. We love that. From Erasmus University Rotterdam. He has held visiting research positions at Cornell Law School, Copenhagen University, and UC Louvain in Belgium, and he frequently consults for various units of the World Bank.
And Professor Dan Etsi, SD, is the Hillhouse Professor at Yale University with primary appointments at Yale's Environmental and Law Schools and a secondary appointment at the Yale School of Management. He serves as director of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy and co-director of the Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance. Professor SD is the author and editor of 12 books and dozens of articles on environmental protection, regulatory reform, energy policy, and sustainability metrics, and their connection to corporate strategy, competitiveness, trade, and economic success. His prize-winning volume, Green to Gold: How Smart Companies Use Environmental Strategy to Innovate, Create Value, and Build Competitive Advantage, was recently named the top green business book of the past decade. From 2011 to early 2014, Professor Esty served as Commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, where he earned a reputation for fresh thinking and practical results. His policy innovations include the launch of Connecticut's first in the nation green bank to promote clean energy using limited public funding to leverage private capital, and the lean restructuring of Connecticut's environmental permitting programs to make the state's regulatory framework lighter, faster, more efficient, and effective. Prior to his Yale professorship, Professor Esty served in a variety of senior positions at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where he helped to negotiate the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. He also worked as a senior fellow for international economics in Washington, D.C.
I think as already been said, we're very grateful both for your scholarship and your time being here with us today. But with those introductions out of the way, we'll turn it over to you folks.
All right, well, let me start. I'm going to give us a little kickoff, and Goran will follow through in some of the depth and detail of the article. But let me just say a very big thank you to Tori, to Linda, to Mike, Sydney, and Kyle as well, and particularly to the LPAR crew that identified our piece, which we're honored to have included in this conversation. And let me also say, following on Mike's suggestion that we're working at the interface between theory and practice, I am just back at Yale after 2 years away on public service leave. I've been living in Geneva, working at the World Trade Organization, where the Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, asked me to come and help her and the team at the WTO to think about how to bring a sustainability agenda to the trade system, how to better align the WTO with the global community's commitment to climate change action. And that really is the backdrop to this piece that Goran and I have been working on for several years, but it really is to fulfill that mission of bringing good theory, careful conceptual framing to real-world practical policy issues that are on the cutting edge of the public agenda globally. And that's where I want to start and just spend a few minutes today. I think, as you all know, we are seeing climate change issues really take off. They're becoming a top-tier concern. Big debate in the U.S., perhaps between the parties, but across the world generally, there's a commitment to climate change action. And I'm just back from the COP28 Climate Change Summit in Dubai that took place in December. And the big issue there, as some of you will know, perhaps some of you were there, was not necessarily the suggestion that some political leaders have made that we had a big transformation in a commitment to transitioning away from fossil fuels. I think that's become clear over time and was not especially remarkably addressed or advanced in Dubai this past December. What I think was the big news was the calibration of how the country by country efforts, the nationally determined contributions to climate change, add up. And that global stocktake suggested that emissions globally are still rising. Now, they're coming down in a number of places, including the United States, but not nearly fast enough to meet the 2021 Glasgow Climate Pact target of a net zero greenhouse gas emissions world by mid-century. There are a couple of exceptions where people may be on track. Really, the only one I think the data shows firmly is Denmark, out of 190 countries that are participating in this global exercise. And I think the question then I saw across the conversation in Dubai, and for those who weren't following closely, we had about 4,000 or 5,000 government officials and about 100,000 other people that showed up. So that's one measure of the intensity of interest, the rising concern. But the question that I heard on everyone's minds after the global stocktake sort of set the context was, what next? What do we do to really ramp up climate change action and push more broadly to a sustainable future? Now, some of the answer is well known. We need more finance, particularly to finance the transition to a clean energy future in the global south. We need companies to step up to this challenge. We need new business models and real corporate sustainability as a prime element of corporate strategy. But all of that is not new. what I heard really emerging in a big way, and perhaps for the first time in a significant way, was that the trade system, based in the World Trade Organization, but including bilateral and regional agreements, including UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and the International Trade Center. Those are the sort of international organization pieces of this system. That there really might be an important role for that structure to play. And here's why. I think you now see across the world a lot of interest in the corporate world in moving toward a sustainable future, in changing business models. But I think there's also a real hesitation as people are getting serious about that, about doing so as a company out in front of the competition. There's a real fear that there might be competitive disadvantage by stepping up, committing capital, changing business approaches, and bearing costs in doing so if others in your industry do not. And that's where there has become this idea that we need some approach to ensure, and this is now economics language, that free riders don't take advantage of this transition moment to steal market share or to cut into the profits of those that are making the transition and investing in this new approach, a sustainable approach to business. So let's jump to the next slide here and we'll dig in a little deeper. So what happened at COP that was of note was that for the first time ever at this gathering, this conference of the parties, and by the way, quiz question of the day for all of you, what is that conference of parties to? The answer, not to hold you in suspense, is the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change, the original climate change treaty. But for the first time in 30 years of these gatherings, there was a thematic trade day alongside other thematic days like Finance Day and Agriculture Day. And for the first time ever, a trade pavilion. And as a result, there were more than 100 sessions, side events, where the trade system was looked at as a potential critical point of policy leverage for driving change. And some of that conversation was driven by Director General of the WTO, Ngozi herself. She was out pushing the reality that the trade system represents one of the best ways to disseminate at speed and scale the technologies for a transition to a clean energy future and the kinds of infrastructure. And not only that, the kind of breakthrough thinking, the policy ideas, the innovation potential, all of that the trade system is capable of doing. And frankly, the real story here is that it could do more if it were revitalized, lifted up, and really developed in a way that would ensure that there is a potential for protecting those that are out front in managing this transition in the business world. And that really is where the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is talked about in the inner circle as CBAM, is driving a debate. The European Union has said we are going to use the trade system and trade structures to ensure that no product coming into the European Union gets competitive advantage by underpricing the domestic European similar products because people are producing in a place that doesn't take climate change as seriously as the European Union. Now, as Goran is about to explain to you, this has put a sharp focus on the details of the border carbon structure, the border carbon adjustment mechanism that the European Union is using. And this is where we think there really does need to be some work done. I will tell you, just to start the conversation, that the idea that the trade system might be the discipline that allows business to work together across an industry and move together in a way that doesn't leave anyone competitively disadvantaged is enormously attractive. And I would argue that the European Union's approach of saying we're going to impose, in effect, a special tariff, one might even call it a penalty tariff, designed to take away the competitive advantage of anyone whose production doesn't meet the commitments to climate change action the global community has made, I think is conceptually correct. We don't want anyone in the 21st century to get competitive advantage by underperforming on environmental standards, beginning with, but eventually not limited to, climate change commitments. I think it is not just conceptually correct, but having spent 30 years on climate change policy, I would tell you from my point of view, it looks to me like it is policy essential. The progress, as we heard from the Global Stocktake report, is not proceeding as it needs to. And we really need to find a way to pull people together and lift up the global response to this threat of climate change. And I think the way to do that is to ensure that this kind of approach, this border carbon adjustment approach to the problem, is done in a way that's thoughtful, serious, transparent, scientifically grounded, and analytically rigorous. And that's what Goran and I are trying to lay the foundation for. So with that, Goran, over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Dan. And thanks a lot to Michael, Linda, Sydney, Kyle, and Tori for the invite. It's really a pleasure to be here. So let me pick up from where Dan left. Our presentation is, of course, about border carbon adjustment mechanism. For those that are not familiar with this topic, think about it as a charge that targets the greenhouse gas emissions that are embedded in imported products. And as Dan was saying, it aims primarily to address carbon leakage. And it does so in two ways. On the one hand, it levels the playing field in the importing country, so helping the domestic producers to stay competitive. And at the same time, it also incentivizes more ambitious climate action abroad. To understand why this is the case, consider the situation where you are the government of an exporting country, and you see some of your export that is under a border carbon adjustment mechanism. What you could do, it's in essence to let your producers pay a charge to another country. You could, say, facilitate your domestic producers in reducing emissions and therefore reducing the charge. Or alternative, you could implement some policies yourself and hoping that the importing country will take into account these policies, so credit these policies in the implementation of the carbon price at the border. Now, and this is actually really the focus of our paper. In essence, in our paper, what we discuss is what is the price that should be applied to greenhouse gas emissions that are embedded in imported products, with a specific regards to the issue of the comparison of the policies that are implemented in the importing country and the exporting country. So imagine that you are, there is an importing country, let's call it country A. This country implements a border carbon adjustment mechanism to, let's say, facilitate the competitiveness of its domestic producers, given that this country also implements a carbon tax of, let's say, $100 per ton of carbon. So the question here, what would be the price that is applied on greenhouse gas emissions that that are embedded in products that are imported to this country? Imagine here that you have another country that exports to the country A and implements a carbon tax of $30 per ton of carbon. The question is, what should be the charge applied? Here, should it be $100? Should it be $70? Should it be something else? And this is really, I say, the focus of our research. To answer this question, we first developed a taxonomy of options to design border carbon adjustment mechanism. The first option would be that we distinguish would be to not credit any policy that is implemented in the exporting country. So here, in essence, regardless of what the exporting country does, the importing country charges the full price that applies to domestic producers. The second option would be to instead credit, so take into account only explicit carbon prices. And by this, we mean prices that are applied by with a carbon tax or an emission trading scheme. And here, in essence, that the price that is applied equals the difference between the explicit carbon price implemented in the importing country and the explicit carbon price applied in the exporting country. And this is the approach that has been adopted so far by the EU with the CBAM regulation that Dan has mentioned earlier. And that's why you see the little flag next to it. The third option would be to credit for a bit broader set of policies, including carbon taxes, emission trading schemes, but also other type of policies that increase the marginal cost of emitting greenhouse gases without targeting the greenhouse gases embedded in products directly, or without targeting the carbon content of the fuels that have been burned in producing those products. And so think about, for instance, an energy tax that simply a gasoline tax or a diesel tax. And so we call this effective GHG pricing, which accounts for both explicit carbon pricing and instruments that price carbon implicitly. The fourth option that we consider is to credit for all GHG policies. beyond those that are pricing mechanism per se. And this is the approach that, for instance, seems to be suggested in the Fair Transition and Competition Act of 2021. And that's why you see the US flag next to it. Now, what we do in our paper, it's in essence to focus really on two of these approaches, the two central ones, and we don't consider the non-crediting one, primarily because we think that politically it's difficult to defend. It's difficult to impose a charge on export from a country without accounting for the policies that this country is putting in place in its own jurisdiction. We also don't account, we don't consider further in the analysis the, let's say, the crediting for all policies approach. And this is primarily because from an administrative standpoint, it would be very difficult to implement. It would be very difficult to implement because when you implement a border carbon adjustment mechanism, you need to have not only information about the emissions embedded in the products that you're importing, but also information about what are the policies that are implemented in the exporting country, and then come up with methodologies that can help converting those policies in an equivalent carbon price. It's easier to do so for a pricing policy than for other policies. And so that's why we focus on the two central ones, and we compare them along 4 criteria. One would be, of course, what is their likely climate change effects. The second one is the administrative feasibility of these approaches, the political acceptability, and then the GATT compatibility. And I'm going to run through these 4 approaches now. Now, starting from the climate change effects, in principle, one could start with the thought that having a border carbon adjustment mechanism that, say, incentivizes exporting countries to implement an explicit carbon price, it's better than having a policy that incentivizes other countries to implement any policies that increases the marginal cost for emitting carbon. And this is because, say, if you compare the GHG effectiveness, the climate effectiveness of a carbon tax with a fuel tax, the carbon tax is generally superior. Now, despite this, we think that there are at least two reasons why crediting for a broader set of policies can lead to better climate outcomes. The first one is that it leaves more freedom to the exporting country to adopt policies that are better suited for its internal priorities. And it also, and this is particularly important when it comes to carbon pricing, because we know that various countries face political challenges in implementing an explicit carbon pricing instrument. I mean, the US at the federal level, it's a great example of that. And other countries instead focus capacity constraints, especially when it comes to implementing a cap and trade system that require a certain level of let's say, of capacity to be put in place. And so if you leave broader options for the exporting country to react to the border carbon adjustment mechanism and see those efforts credited for, it's likely that you will see greater climate action in the exporting countries. Second reason why crediting for a broader set of policies can be better is that it creates transparency on the level of greenhouse gas, of pricing that are implemented in exporting countries. And this can be quite important when you consider the possibility that countries implement tax shifts. So it is common for countries, when they implement an explicit carbon price, to at the same time reduce other taxes that applies to fuel. And so if you credit only for an explicit carbon price, you don't capture this change, the net change. You will only see what is the increased carbon price that is applied in the exporting country. A great example is the Uruguayan carbon tax. Now it's the highest carbon tax in the world, $155 per ton of carbon. When it was implemented a couple of years ago, the government at the same time reduced drastically the gasoline and diesel taxes. So now if you look only at the carbon tax itself, you think, oh, this Uruguay is doing much more than before with regards to climate change. This could be the case, but at the same time, it's important that you take into account also the reduced incentive to decarbonize that derive from the scaling back of other type of taxes. And so, I say, creating more transparency on the overall GHG price applied in the exporting countries can be important for the application of the border carbon adjustment mechanism, and also to create trust among countries. With regards to administrative feasibility, we do recognize that the crediting only for explicit carbon prices it's easier It's much easier because you have only about 40 countries that have an explicit carbon price in place nowadays. Also, you don't need to have sophisticated methodologies to understand what is the carbon price is applied in that country. Is moving a bit for, say, expanding the type of policies that are credited for poses additional challenges. Again, you need to come up with methodologies to understand what is the price applied in the exporting jurisdiction. But nonetheless, what we say in the paper is that there is knowledge to build upon. On the one hand, there are countries, especially some of those that are now, that have or are thinking to implement border carbon adjustment mechanisms, have quite well-established rules to calculate countervailing and anti-dumping duties, and this capacity can be harnessed to implement border carbon adjustment mechanisms that takes into account a broader policy context in the exporting country compared to creating only for explicit carbon pricing. And on the other hand, and perhaps even more importantly, there are various organizations that are working now on estimating effective carbon prices in different jurisdictions. These include the OECD, the IMF, and the World Bank. And so this institution can provide support to countries that are interested in implementing carbon border adjustment mechanisms that account for a broader set of policies. But they, in principle, when, say, estimates created by these institutions are sufficiently refined, they could also be used as default values for the implementation of border carbon adjustment mechanism. Now, having said this, we recognize that let's say, there are administrative challenges in implementing border carbon adjustment mechanisms that account for a broad set of policies. But so what we envision is more like a gradual approach whereby the number of policies credited for increases over time as capacity is built. Political acceptability. This is, of course, is very important. And again, here we see an advantage of crediting for a broader set of policies, simply because many countries don't have an explicit carbon price in place. These include also the United States and India, so large economies that, of course, have a weight also in the trading system. And while every country implements an implicit carbon price, and so every country here would see their effort recognized. And this is also more aligned with the Paris Agreement, the bottom-up approach that every country decides for itself which policies to implement to address climate change. And so this is, again, it's important to align the trade regime with the climate change regime. And more broadly, if the border carbon adjustment mechanism is implemented as part of a climate club, having the US part of the climate club would be potentially important for political reasons, and of course also for the coverage of greenhouse gas emissions. And again, having a border carbon adjustment mechanism that credits for a broader set of policies makes it easier for the US to be part of such club. With regards to, I don't want to run over time, with regards to GATT compatibility, we also think that there is a general advantage of crediting for a broader set of policies. Let's say, if you credit for a broader set of policies that every country has put in place, it's more difficult to argue that you are discriminating some of the exporting jurisdictions. And this can be also quite important with regards to compatibility with Article 20, because given the flexibility that you have that you give with the border carbon adjustment mechanisms that credits for effective carbon prices, you are not forcing other countries to implement only explicit carbon pricing per se. I say you're not even making an arbitrary distinction to say I credit for this policy, but not the other one. And so in essence, starting from the question of what are the policies that should be considered in establishing the price applied to greenhouse gas emissions embedded in importing products, we look at two options primarily, creating for explicit carbon pricing, the EU options, and a bit broader option, and we compare them along four criteria. As you can see from the table, which doesn't really capture the nuances of the discussion that we just had, crediting for effective carbon prices, we think would be superior in terms of climate change effects, political acceptability, and GATT compatibility. The only remaining issue is the administrative feasibility, for which we say a gradual approach is probably the most reasonable one, where you see an increasing number of policies credited for over time as the capacity is built. With this, I have concluding my presentation. I don't know if Dan, I
So
missed
let-
some. if you want
So
to
let me
add
just
something.
take one more minute, Goran, to take us back up to the big picture. So I think what you've seen here is a picture of how border carbon adjustment has emerged as a critical issue that is going to be required to integrate the trade system behind the global commitments on climate change action. And I think what you're hearing us argue is that, again, as I said, conceptually, the CBAM is correct. From a policy point of view, essential, but in some fundamental ways, flawed. And we have highlighted in this piece one of those flaws in particular, which is this question of the ability to adjust for equivalent or comparable policies across countries, rather than a narrow focus on just explicit carbon pricing, or greenhouse gas pricing to be more specific, as the gauge of comparability. So we do think that's a flaw. More broadly, we think the European Union is pushing forward on a unilateral basis, and that's hard to create legitimacy around this approach when there hasn't been a negotiated kind of foundation for it. And let's just quickly highlight three other aspects of what could have been and maybe should be negotiated. One is how you measure the greenhouse gas emissions associated with traded goods. Now, this probably needs to be done on an industry by industry basis with relevant experts. There are international organizations that have capacity. The WTO could host this. The International Trade Center is working on these issues. The OECD is. A lot of industry associations are prepared to contribute to this measurement idea. And I think there needs to be protocols that establish an agreed upon approach to measurement. Second of all is what price gets applied. So once you've measured how much of a gap there is from one country's approach to the next, what price do you apply? And there it would be much, again, more helpful if we had an agreed upon global social cost of greenhouse gases that could be applied, rather than having the European Union assert its own approach. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I think the CBAM has not taken seriously a background concept that's important in the climate change arena, important in the trade arena, and that's how you are fair to developing countries. So a question of equity. And we would argue that the European Union needs to take that more seriously, again, to build a recognition that their approach here is serious about lifting countries that are importing into Europe to meet higher sustainability standards, and not simply to block them from the marketplace. So this really needs to be demonstrated not to be green protectionism or green mercantilism, but rather an attempt to lift everyone up and ensure that we all meet the emerging sustainability standards of the 21st century, climate change commitments in particular. So with that, over to our
I'll take it.
moderators.
Thank you, Dan and Goran. That was really informative and thoughtful. I want to make sure we recognize that the article you just presented was originally published in the Arizona Law Review. And as Mike noted earlier, this article, along with several others, will be published in condensed form in August in ELI's Environmental Law Reporter. So if you don't want to read the original version of this article, which had almost 200 footnotes, you can wait for the condensed version. I do want to remind everyone to put questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many of those as we can in a few minutes. But right now I'm going to hand it over to our Vanderbilt Law students, Kyle and Sydney, to ask a few questions.
Thanks so much, Professor Breggin. So I think a natural first question for us as students reading some of these pieces, especially with major policy changes happening in the intervening time between these dialogues and when you publish the paper, is how maybe some of your premises or thoughts have changed. I think you got to some of that, and since most of the audience hasn't really had a chance to read all 200 footnotes, I'll maybe reframe it a little bit. And that, what was it about the European Union CBAM mechanism, CBAM kind of policy, that really changed the game? Was it that they actually did it? Was it some particular approach they took that kind of caught some people by surprise? That it seems like out of the blue this thing happened that nobody seemed to be expecting, and now it's the talk of the town. Is that a fair characterization, or is it just some aspect of that particular policy that's kind of led to this renewed debate?
So why don't I start, and let's see if Goran wants to add. But first of all, it's not out of the blue. The European Union has been signaling that this has been coming for 5 years, and it's being implemented over several more years. So right now it's in what I would call the practice round, where there is an attempt to gauge what the tariff would be, but the tariff is not being collected. But it has gotten people serious. And I would also say it's not just a credit to the European Union that they have signaled that they're going to go forward on this, but I think more broadly in the background is a recognition that the trade system is in some trouble. It's seen as the source of serious tensions in a number of places. It's what was behind the Brexit vote in Britain. It certainly was one of the agenda items that Donald Trump exploited in getting elected in 2016, and clearly is going to bring this agenda back in 2024. And I do think there's an interest in a trade system reform that aligns the system with public values that people care about. And I'm arguing more broadly in a number of places that there is a moment now of opportunity for that more comprehensive reform. For those who are interested, as a result of my work with Goran and 399 other people, 400 scholars and researchers and policymakers, we produced a comprehensive trade system reform called the VLAR Framework for a Sustainable Trade System. And that's produced by a group operating under the banner of the Remaking Trade Project. So if anyone wants to see this, remakingtradeproject.org, you can pull down this report. And it sets into a broader context the work we're proposing here about border carbon adjustment, the alignment with climate change, and really offers a bigger picture. And I think it's that idea that the trade system needs a relook from top to bottom and needs to be rethought to be really seen as constructive and appropriate to where we need to go as a world community, and from a point of view of the United States, that kind of reform process needs to go forward.
Dan, have you already published that in the legal literature? Or are you planning on doing so?
We have not published it. It's out there as a 160-page report. Mike, it was just this week a version 2.0 released. It's called the VLAR Framework because the original draft was taken to the Swiss mountain town of Villars, and 110 high-level officials from all across the world were brought in for 3 days of pushing and pulling on the agenda. In effect, a peer review in the spirit, Mike, of what you said. We need more conceptually rigorous, analytically serious framing to drive reform and to really shape policy. And so with that in mind, we had kind of a substantive and political peer review. And based on that, there's this revised version that's out. But we should finish offline the conversation about whether there's an opportunity to put that forward. And I do think it's attracting enormous traction. And that's part of what the conversation was in Dubai at COP28. It got a lot of attention at the World Economic Forum just a couple of weeks ago in Switzerland. So I think there is an interest in what the broader reform looks like, and then the details, frankly, of this leading edge that Europe has put forward. And I think, just to say one more thing about that, I think Europe gets credit for having said we're going forward. And you know, there is a worry about the unilateralism. On the other hand, people are saying, I guess we better get serious. And frankly, the US is doing the same thing on the flip side of this conversation about what's the right path on climate change. In the case of the United States, it's not jarring people with a border carbon adjustment, but with huge subsidies, unparalleled subsidies to kind of fund the transition to a clean energy future. And that too is under question. So my view is the WTO needs a new approach to standards, helping the European Union legitimize its actions, and a new approach to subsidies, helping legitimize and understand what the US is doing.
Great. And Sydney and Kyle, we'll defer to you, but we should keep our eyes out on LPAR for that piece when Dan converts it into a law review article.
Yeah, that was actually my next follow-up question. So a lot of the audience here today is probably practitioners that maybe don't want to read the 160-page report. So in that respect, when you think about some of these entities, governments or otherwise, getting serious or playing catch up in this world now, are there any bills or agencies, governments that you're like looking to for signals about who the next movers are, what the next moves are going to be, just so people can stay on top of what is obviously a very dynamic and like fast moving area of the law?
Goran, you want to jump in?
So it's a great question, and I don't know if I have a clear answer there. One thing that I see with the EU is that CBAM is only one of the various policies that have been put in place recently that actually have an extraterritorial effect. So there is the extension of the ETS to international shipping, covers 50% of greenhouse gas emissions in, say, voyages to and from the European Union. There is the forestry regulation that deals with timber and sustainable production of timber. And what I hear is that people in other countries that are trying to come to say to somehow to stay on top of everything that the European Union is doing is actually quite struggling with that. And in part, I think it's also a responsibility of EU institutions to be better at communicating what they're doing, because there is a lot of communication happening on their updates that they're making, and that is very confusing and can create, as a confusion can also create some level of opposition or in some way, frighten a potential, someone that could be impacted by that. And so I think one thing that as part of this, say, attention towards the exporting countries, especially developing countries with perhaps capacity, some countries, they have a lot, in others perhaps a little bit less, would be an effort from the European Union to make a more clear communication on what is happening, what they're doing. And so perhaps, you know, having an easy communication tool, would be a good idea. Yeah. I don't know if you want to add something, Dan.
So I would just say, I think the debate is also getting serious in the United States. There's legislation that's been put forward by Senator Coons and some others, the Prove It Act. There's a bill from Senator Cassidy and Lindsey Graham, which is the Foreign Pollution Free Act. And there's a Clean Competition Act that's been put forward by Senator Whitehouse. And then a Market Choice Act by a couple of representatives, Fitzpatrick and Karbala. And I think what you see is the U.S. folks are starting to say, well, we better figure out how we match the European Union in addressing these concerns about not having our industries disadvantaged as we push them to transition to a clean energy future. So again, a competitiveness concern. And as Goran pointed out, a carbon leakage concern. You don't want simply industries to pick up and move from Europe or the United States to developing nations where they might be held to lesser standards. So that would, in effect, not get us reducing emissions, but simply shift them from Europe or the United States to the developing world. So that's not a good answer from a climate policy point of view. So I do think this conversation is now moving. It's going to require some attention. I think it's tough to see really significant moves, either domestically or internationally, in the short term, given the political dynamic, not only of the United States, but I think 50 countries have elections this year. And this is the kind of hard legislative slogging that's not easily done in an election year. But I do think conversations are beginning. For those who are following this space, you would know that the WTO has a big ministerial conference at the end of the month, the so-called 13th conference going by the acronym MC13. In Abu Dhabi. So again, interestingly, in the United Arab Emirates, as the climate conference in December was. And I think you're seeing a push to, at least over time, lay down foundations for better alignment, as Goran and I are calling for, between the climate change regime on the one hand and the trade system on the other.
I have a follow-up question on some of the U.S. proposals. So Professor Dominioni touched on a little bit the U.S., at the federal level, a strong resistance to explicit carbon pricing. And some of these proposals that we've seen, like the Prove It Act that Professor Este mentioned, these are proposals for carbon tariffs, which would be levied on the carbon content of imports, but they don't include a domestic carbon pricing counterpart. And so my question is, how likely is it that any of these proposals would exceed in terms of political feasibility? I think they have the bonus, not only of being appealing to the climate conscious crowd, but also having these kind of conservative appeal of being tough on trade. So how politically feasible are these? And what are these proposals like in terms of compliance with World Trade Organization law?
So just a quick answer, because I don't want to take too much time, and one could have a half an hour conversation on this alone. But I think what you're seeing is that the real goal is not about the price of carbon, although there are many who believe that the best way to really move the world systematically towards a clean energy future would be some broad-based commitment to carbon pricing. And I think you see that being pushed from the World Bank, the IMF, Dr. Ngozi at the WTO talks about the value of a carbon pricing framework because, as our piece suggests, it gives you an easier basis for judging equivalence and trying to get people to move together. But I think the political dynamics are so different across different countries. You know, the US and Europe having chosen very different approaches to climate change action. One needs a trade structure that can accommodate that political and policy diversity. And I think in that regard, what we're trying to do here and what some of these legislative efforts recognize is really focus on what's ultimately important, and that is low greenhouse gas production and goods. And that is what we really need to measure. And I think the US legislation is getting at that issue. And it could be done through pricing, but it need not be. It can simply be that we're going to push people over time to produce in ever cleaner ways.
Hey, just that makes me wonder, Dan, you've been such a leader on the private sector activity, green to gold, et cetera. Yet the whole structure is focused on policies, and policies assume government action. And yet, you know, much of the carbon emissions reductions in the US is the effect of private sector action, supply chain contracting, ESG investing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the demand for renewable power. I wonder whether, is it just too hard to assess or get to agreement on total carbon emissions or carbon intensity or some other metric that doesn't assume that it's government policy that we're focused on, partly as a way to increase the political feasibility, so you get some folks on the right on board who may not be very favorable to any government action whatsoever? Is that viable? Is it just not possible to do that?
I think the challenge is that there's a lot of ways to slip through the net if you don't have an agreed upon structure that is enforced in some way. And by the way, you know, you and I together have been out there saying it doesn't all need to be regulation. I think another important point of leverage, frankly, in this context, is the investor world. And there is a growing number of sustainability-minded investors who are saying they want better alignment between their values and their portfolios. That has pushed people in the finance world to get serious about climate change and has led to the organization a couple of years ago at the Glasgow COP26 of something that has the very unfelicitous acronym of GFANZ, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, but led by Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England. And he's really trying to rally the finance world to say, in effect, we're not going to lend to people unless they're on a trajectory toward net zero emissions by 2050. So I think that's another point of push. But I do think there's value in trying to have a backstop structure that holds companies to a common standard. Because what I see, and frankly, we should turn the question around and Mike, have you answer it as well. I see business leaders ready to move, but really worried about getting out in front of the pack and having that come back at them in competitive disadvantage. So I'm eager to hear if you have thoughts on what that backstop structure could be. Right. But I have looked long and hard and come to the conclusion that the very best option available is the global trading system.
Right. No, I think that's a real advance. And I don't have a simple answer. I'd say two really quick things. One is we've learned through our research that conservatives engage in solution aversion when it comes to government policy, right? So it is not the quality of climate science or the value of the policy. It's the fact that government action is there, and that's more troubling to many people than the climate problem itself. So bypassing solution aversion on government is a valuable thing. And so I think that's a starting point. And I think the other piece of the puzzle from my perspective is actually a change in orientation among NGOs who tend to try to kill anyone who's doing a partially good job, but not perfect in this area. And I think that then induces corporate managers to be very wary about making let's say, a net neutral commitment and only being able to satisfy of it, even though half of a commitment may be a very substantial change. I don't know, Goran, if you've seen some of that activity as well.
So it's the issue of government, especially with regards to carbon pricing. It's always something that puzzles me. I work primarily on carbon pricing, and the idea of, see, in a way, carbon pricing, you could sell it to a conservative person to say you are addressing a market failure. So that could be a narrative that sometimes can help talking with at least some the say think tanks that are more conservative in nature. At the same time, if it's seen as a tax, then that is completely rejected. And so it's I say it's especially in the United States is particularly an issue. European countries have been struggling with that as well. Think about the yellow vest protests in France and other countries that have been struggling with that. But it's not the only. So these are not only examples in Europe. You have also in other places. And so in some way, I don't know. My sense is that a lot of the discussion around these policies tend to, and going also back to what Dan was saying on the global carbon price, implemented equally in every country, it's something that can be, in some way can help addressing some carbon leakage and equalize marginal abatement costs, but it's not probably something that we should pursue specifically, and instead focus on, in some way, every country has its own political approach that works there. And this is a little bit also aligned with what we were saying in our paper, to leave freedom to countries in addressing the ways, climate change in the way that works for them.
So let me just add a quick thought there. And Mike, I'm not at all surprised that this is hard sledding. As I think you know, I wrote a book in 1994 called Greening the Gap, before there even was a World Trade Organization. And that book only in the last 2 years has had its second printing. So it's had a long, slow go. But I think there is important ways to do a blended version of what you're calling for. And I think that the idea of a government backstop. So here's my big suggestion in that regard. Let's involve business and industry in setting the standards. I think if the standards are set by the business leaders, the conservative aversion, as you put it, to moving along with government action, if the government's simply backing up something that the industry itself put out there, I think there's an opportunity. And the other thing I would just say is that I think we're doing in this whole reform area, and certainly our proposal, some of the hard work that should have been done over the past decades. The agreement that set up the WTO came into being in 1995, called the Marrakesh Agreement, actually has in its first paragraph a commitment to sustainable development. In fact, it says, and I'm paraphrasing, this push to open markets, trade liberalization is not an end into itself, but rather a means to the end of sustainable development. And it mentions environmental protection explicitly. So I think what Goran and I are doing, and what I think others are starting to do, is to flesh out what that looks like in practice. Now, this could have and should have been done in the 1990s into the early 2000s. But as I tell people now when I talk about this, better late than never.
What a great point. Sydney, I'm sure you have further questions. I don't want to get in the way of that.
Actually, I got a question, a sort of follow-up question. That Sydney's kind of inspired me to learn more about international law. When I think about how some of the lessons you've learned from either the EU's application of CBAM or just these conversations that are going on more broadly, if there are any lessons you can translate to the domestic context, particularly when you think about interstate trade. So obviously, California's had a cap and trade program for a very long time, and they've been trying to grapple with their carbon border adjustment mechanism that doesn't violate, the Dormant Commerce Clause, things like that. So do you have any insights that you could translate maybe from your international work to the domestic context?
Well,
in about 60 seconds.
All right, I was going to say, I think one of the things that we learned is there's going to be diversity, even more so internationally, but diversity across the states. And by the way, it's not just California. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast puts a carbon price on utility emissions as well. And I do think that's, by the way, an issue for CBAM. They should credit subnational carbon pricing as well as national carbon pricing in this equivalence conversation that we're pushing. But I do think it's important to say we have to deal with the messiness of political reality, and we can't let policy success await a perfect, beautiful, clean system. And that's why we're eager to get into the messiness and try to make sense of it.
So I'm going to jump in here. We had some great questions in the chat, many of which were answered, at least in part, in this discussion. And I'm going to assume that Dan and Goran are happy to take emails from people who have been listening. Your email addresses are on your university websites, I'm sure. We did get to touch on a lot of them, as I said, but we do try to keep these on time so that people will tune in at their lunchtime. So I am going to hand it over to Tori to wrap this up, unless anybody wants to jump in with just, 30 seconds of any final thoughts.
I would just say, I think what we've seen here today is evidence, Sydney and Kyle, that we've made the right choice in picking this piece. And we really look forward to looking for your next pieces as you flesh this out.
Yes, thanks so much. Tori?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone in our audience for joining us today. And a special thanks to our authors, Goran Dominioni and Dan Esty. Just a reminder that today's recording and slides will be posted online at the LPAR website. And please do join us at the LPAR conference in Washington, D.C. on April 5th, where we will be discussing 3 more top LPAR articles. And as always, follow the Environmental Law Institute on your socials. Hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.